Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Sandel's great book, and we'll be looking at chapter 2, Utilitarianism. So we'll look at a particular account of the nature of a just society. And in fact, utilitarianism is a very ambitious theory that captures not just what a good society is, but captures a lot of aspects of morality. And one of the beauties of utilitarianism is that it is a simple theory. It's just one basic principle. And here is the basic principle of utilitarianism. It claims that the highest principle of morality is to maximize happiness, the overall balance of pleasure over pain. And Bentham, depicted here, thought that there was a lot of beauty to this principle. He was very influenced by the scientific way of thinking. So he was in the midst of science. He was one of the pioneers in economics as a science. And he thought that he can bring in some of the insights of the physical sciences onto morality. And he knew of previous traditions of philosophers, of thinkers that talked about virtue and vice, that theorized about good intentions and bad intentions, and so on. And one of the things that bothered or that sat uncomfortably with Bentham was the inability to measure accurately those things. He thought that moral philosophy as a discipline couldn't become rigorous enough until it became more verifiable, empirically verifiable. And he thought that pleasure and pain were very empirically verifiable, or at least much more than the other categories that people were working with. And that this single principle would be a way of unifying another great scientific virtue, a way of unifying all of morality. So one makes an action the right action, well, that it maximizes happiness, happiness defined in terms of pleasure and pain. And one makes a policy good, a just policy, well, that it maximizes happiness. One makes a society good, that it maximizes happiness. One makes a moral agent, a good moral agent, that they maximize happiness. So every moral question can be answered in slightly different ways, but can be answered by the same basic principle. And Bentham thought that was very illuminating, that was very enlightening. One of the great beauties of this principle, he thought, is that it enables you to answer otherwise inscrutable questions, otherwise extremely difficult to answer questions. In the face of a moral dilemma, should you lie or should you, tell the truth, even if telling the truth hurts the sentiments of someone else, someone you care about? Those kinds of moral dilemmas. Many theories struggle with those, how to make sense of what the right thing to do is in that context. And one of the things that really moved Bentham is that utilitarianism gives you a straightforward answer. Just measure the consequences. Who's going to be hurt by your actions? Who's going to be made happy? And just measure that. How much happiness is going to come about? How much misery is going to come about? And choose the action that maximizes, that brings about the most quantity of happiness. Very simple principle that captures it all. And also articulated perhaps for the first time, certainly clearly for the first time in history, is something that we care about a lot, namely equality. We say that we are equal and that that matters. And one of the beauties of Bentham's utilitarianism is that it gives us a very precise, very sharp way of articulating what that equality amounts to. What does it say to say that people are equal? It can be that they're equally intelligent, that they're equally talented, that they have equal amount of access to wealth and opportunities. It cannot be those things. So what is it that we're talking about when we say that people have equal dignity? From the moral perspective, how do we go about ensuring that people are treated equally in the moral sense of equally? And here is what Bentham said, the principle of equal consideration. From the moral perspective, the happiness of everyone involved in an action, in a policy, in an institution, counts equally. So equality is to be measured in terms of when one is calculating how to go about deciding what's the right action. Utilitarianism says measure the consequences, measure the happiness of those involved. The principle of equal consideration says, oh, and by the way, those happiness count the same. That someone you like is being hurt does not matter that you like them. It matters that they're being hurt. That someone you dislike is being hurt. What matters is not that you dislike them. It's not the relationship they have to you that makes it morally relevant. It's that they're getting hurt. That's the morally relevant consideration. And if two people are getting hurt, what matters is that they're two people, not the relationship to you. From the moral perspective, it is their happiness, their absence of pain, acquisition of pleasure. that matters. That's the equality. When you think about them, in such a way that you count their happiness equally, regardless of whether you like them or not, or, some other considerations. So this principle gives you a sense of impartiality. That's a good way of grounding sound moral judgments. So there's a lot to be said for this principle, even if you disagree with other parts of Bentham. So again, Bentham thought that utilitarianism was this scientific way of thinking, and yeah, of course, science is great. So he thought it brings in systematicity and rigor onto the enterprise of morality that was lacking before. So that's great. That's wonderful. That's what's driving his thinking, a lot of his thinking, and his pupil Mill, John Stuart Mill, as well. It is crucial to make this explicit. So build with utilitarianism. If you notice, it says something like maximize happiness, and then it gives you a description of what happiness is, the overall balance of pleasure and over pain, more pleasure, less pain. Let's actually label that thing. It is a claim about the nature of happiness, and it says that happiness is pleasure. The better life is the one that has more pleasure and less pain. Arguably, this is the weakest part of the theory. Most of us want to say that pleasure is wonderful, it's great, let's have more of it, but that's not the absolute measurement of happiness, right? Something seems to have gone wrong when someone says that. But again, Bentham's motivation is scientific. Pleasure is much more measurable than other things, like being honest. It's hard to measure honesty. Courage is hard to measure courage. Good intentions, it's very hard to measure those things. Pleasure, well, we can measure that more accurately. So he's willing to sacrifice some of the plausibility of his conception of his theory for the ability to measure them, for the ability for them to be more scientifically rigorous. And that's what's behind his theory. So here's something that follows, or here's something that's crucial from this conception of happiness. Virtue and happiness come apart. The Aristotelian tradition, articulated by Waddell, by the people that we've looked at, is that to be happy is to flourish as an individual. To be happy is to become a better version of yourself, which is the virtues. The intellectual and moral virtues are the way of going about telling that you have a happy life, you have a fulfilled life, you have a life in which you're maximizing your potential, your truly human potentials. All of that's out the window with Bentham. Happiness just is maximization of pleasure, whatever it is that gives you pleasure. So he has a very individual conception of happiness. What gives you pleasure may not give me pleasure. People are different. And the way of articulating that difference is in terms of what pleases them, what kinds of experiences do people enjoy. And sometimes they're the same, right? Like, it's hard to not like chocolate. But there are other kinds of experiences, thrills that people like, some people like and others do not. And that is, that varies from person to person. A lot of pleasures vary from person to person. And Bentham thinks that happiness is to each his own, and to his or her own. If that's what gives you pleasure, that's what makes you happy. And you're the final arbiter or authority in figuring out whether the experience is pleasurable. No one can tell you what makes you happy. You just have to experience it and see if you like it. So it has this radical individualist conception of happiness as pleasure. So pleasure and happiness come apart. Some people they'll derive pleasure out of doing the right thing, being virtuous, promoting the common good. Other people do not. From Bentham's perspective, those that enjoy doing the right thing become happy by doing it because they derive pleasure out of it. But some people, perhaps a lot of people, do not enjoy doing the right thing. And for those people, it is not happiness that comes about by doing the right thing. So for those people, those that do not enjoy doing the right thing, Bentham thinks that they should still do it, right? Morality has no bounds in that sense. You ought to do what is right, and you still be vicious if you don't. But for those people that don't enjoy doing the right thing, they have two different motivations. One is towards their happiness and one is towards virtue, and those are just incompatible. Sometimes morality is kind of tragic in that sense. You ought to do what is right because it's right, even if it doesn't make you happy. And that's just how it is for some people, he thinks. Morality, virtue and happiness come apart in a way in which, say, for Aristotle, they do not. For Aristotle, you become a better version of yourself by developing the virtues, and that is what makes you happy, whether you enjoy it or not. Aristotle thinks that in the long run you will enjoy it, and that's wonderful. But virtue and happiness do not come apart for Aristotle. They do for Bentham. Because of his conception of happiness. And it's crucial to see that. everyone ought to promote the happiness of everyone else because that's the moral command, and they may or may not be happy about it. So let's look at objections to utilitarianism. Some of the distinctive characteristics of the views come to the fore in seeing how they respond to objections, and also our ability to understand whether or not that's a good view, that's a view we should believe, can be tested by those objections, so we can think about the situation better. And an important objection to utilitarianism is that it seems to make no space for individual rights. So what happens when the well-being of one clashes with the well-being of many? From the utilitarian perspective, everyone counts as one, equal principle of equal consideration. So it's not that the one is ignored, it's taken into consideration. However, there's still more people on the other side. So when the happiness of 5 is clashing with happiness of 1, from the utilitarian perspective, the course of action is obvious. Do the thing that maximizes the happiness of the 5 instead of the 1. Why? Well, precisely because more happiness comes about, and that is what makes the action correct. So think about the trolley example and so on that Sandel puts forth. Here's an example that he uses as an objection to utilitarianism. Think of the horrible history of Christian being thrown onto the lions for the sake of the amusement of the crowds and other considerations as well. From a strong conception of individual rights, that is obviously mistaken. That obviously has gone wrong. People should not be sacrificed for the sake of the entertainment of others. It doesn't matter how much joy those that are being entertained derive from the event, from the experience. Being torn apart by lions is a horrible thing to do a human being. They have the individual right not to be thrown into the lions, regardless of how happy other people might be at that. That seems like the correct, concrete judgment in that particular case. Yet utilitarians have a hard time with that case because arguably, if the stadium is full and everyone derives a lot of joy out of seeing Christian being torn apart, more joy can come about, at least in principle, from throwing Christians into the lions, despite despite the fact that Christians will suffer a lot, as long as their suffering when they're torn apart by the lions is less than the quantity of pleasure and joy that these spectators get from the activity, then utilitarianism seems to imply that that's the right thing to do, to throw Christians into lions. But that seems horrible. That seems exactly not virtuous thing, not the right thing. And that a moral theory like utilitarianism seems to entail, at least in some conditions, that it's a serious objection against utilitarianism as stated. So even if the joy of the spectators is greater than the pain of the Christians, even if that's true, the utilitarian calculation comes out that way, it still seems clearly wrong to sacrifice people for the sake of the entertainment of others, even if those others are a lot of people. So that example of the Christians seems to be a serious objection to utilitarianism. And you may be tempted to derive from that the general principle: when the happiness of many clashes with the rights of few, the rights of few trump, right? You might be thinking, no, that's the right general principle. But it's not clear that that's always the case. So remember moral reflection, identification of moral principles, comparing them with particular judgments. So here's an example that puts that principle, that latter principle about individual rights versus maximization of welfare, puts that into question. Think of a homeowners association. Suppose there's a community of people and that they get together one time, the homeowners association gets together, and someone proposes building a park within the territory of the homeowners association. And everyone thinks, most people think, that's wonderful. We can build a park, our children can go there, they can create space for us to develop relationships. That's a great idea, let's build a park. There will be the fee that will be added to the homeowners association to pay for the park, of course. And that's the proposal. And then the people vote on it. Suppose that the vast majority of people vote in favor of the park. They want to build a park within it. But there's this small faction. There's this 2 or 3 homeowners that refuse. They say, like, no, I don't want to do anything with it. I don't want anything to do with that. I say no to the park. So the vast majority of people think that having building the park within the community would be a good thing, and that they're willing to pay the whatever fee. But 2 or 3 do not. Here's the question for us: is respecting the individual rights and freedom of those few that disagree, is that what we should do? Should the communities just say, "Oh, never mind, we cannot because these two do not agree"? My judgment is, if you agree, let me know. My judgment is that no, the majority wins. Those 2 or 3, their individual rights do not outweigh the will of the whole and the well-being of the whole. The right thing to do in that context is to build a park and to send the fee to those 2 or 3 anyway. Why? Because their individual rights and freedoms do not outweigh the group in that case. So things get complicated. This individual rights is a serious objection, but it's not clear that it always wins. So let's look at John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill recognized the strength of the individual rights objections, and he kind of changed, he nuanced Bentham's utilitarianism. Mill put forth a view that is roughly halfway between Aristotle and Bentham. So he proposed a view that he called utilitarianism, but it's a nuanced kind, and it's a more plausible kind. And at the heart of Mill's proposal is that utility or happiness should be maximized not at each individual action, but in the long run. We should propose the kinds of policies that maximize happiness in the long run throughout time, not just in this particular case. So a good society respects individual rights. He allows space for that, but not because individual rights trump welfare, but because in the long run, welfare is maximized by respecting individual rights. Put differently, go back to the throwing Christians into the lions example. And even if in that particular case, the throwing, a few Christians for the spectators to be amused, even if in that particular case, most welfare is maximized, people's happiness increases, the spectators are happier to see that. Mill's point is that in the long run, a society that allows that has invited kind of recipe for distraction. A lot of people are not going to be very happy with the government organization. They're going to think, well, maybe next time it will be me that is going to be thrown into the lions. And it creates kind of the wrong set of rules that govern society that make other participants in the society feel unease and might not want to be a part of the society, might have very strong reasons for leaving that society, for changing it altogether. But if we have a society in which Christians are not thrown onto lions because individual rights are respected, in the long run, people are going to prefer to be in that society, going to be happier in that society precisely because their chances of being thrown into lions for the sake of the amusement of the spectators is not going to be there. So the happiness of everyone in the long run is going to be maximized by respecting individual rights, not because individual rights are by themselves more important, but because that is the way of going about ensuring that happiness is maximized in the long run. So it's still utilitarian, but it's a kind of nuanced, more clever utilitarian. And so that's the first element, maximization of happiness in the long run. But there's the second element that is very important. And Mill accepts the traditional Aristotelian claim that human happiness is involved or requires something like the development of human capacities, moral sensibilities, reason, imagination, artistic abilities. A flourishing individual is connected to happiness. For Mill, crucially, it's not that flourishing is happiness as such, but that the pleasures of flourishing are the ones that are constitutive of happiness. So his kind of compromise between Bentham and Aristotle is to grant the intuitive claim that a happy individual is one who flourishes, but also granting the Bentham claim that that's very hard to measure. But pleasure is not as hard to measure. So it is the pleasure of flourishing that is happiness, says Mill. And the satisfaction of development of these human faculties is a kind of higher pleasure. So when one is trying to decide, do the utilitarian calculation for figuring out what's the right thing to do, we should take into consideration not just the quantity of pleasure, but the quality of pleasure as well. Is the pleasure that comes about out of these activities the right kind, the kind of virtue? And if so, that should be given a lot more weight than the lower pleasures. Going back again to the Christian example, throwing Christians into the lions, the kind of pleasure that people are getting from seeing the spectacle is not a great one, right? The pleasure of seeing others being torn apart is a very dark, vicious pleasure. So from Mill's perspective, it's pleasures, and so there's some good there, but it's a very low base kind of pleasure. It doesn't have a lot of weight. The pleasure of enjoying a good symphony, the pleasure of good friendship, those are better kinds of pleasures, and those should be given a much greater priority over the lesser pleasures, especially the bad pleasures like the enjoying torture of the other. So if we include quality onto the calculation, we get the right judgment, the much better judgments, insists Mill. So a way of putting Mill's point, and he says this at some point, is that it is better to be a frustrated Socrates than it is to be a satisfied pig. A pig cares about, rolling around in the mud, and having a lot of sexual pleasure, eating a lot. So very raw, basic pleasures. And a satisfied pig is one that keeps doing it over and over again. It has, from its perspective, a very satisfied life. And that is, they satisfy their basic desires constantly. And Socrates, as we've seen, was, ended his life. He was frustrated. He could not convince the Athenians of the way of virtue and truth and philosophy. He was frustrated. He did not have a lot of pleasure in attaining his goals. And yet, Mill thinks the little pleasure that he had, because he knew nobility, virtue, truth, it's much more valuable than the much larger quantity of pleasure the satisfied pig has. And he thinks none of us who know enough about the choice would choose to be the satisfied pig. We would choose to be the frustrated Socrates, because we recognize that there's a quality difference. The kind of pleasure that Socrates has, even though it's largely frustrated, is better than the much larger quantity the pig has. So that's utilitarianism. I want to end this discussion by talking about a paradox. This is not in the text, but it's a wonderful paradox that everyone should know. And it's a paradox about thinking of happiness as pleasure. There's something, the more you think about it, kind of paradoxical about it. That's why it's called a paradox. And here is framed in terms of an argument. So here's the argument that is the paradox. Claim number one, premise number one, hedonism is the view that only pleasure is valuable. So premise number one just is the definition of what hedonism is. The only thing that matters, that makes you happy, that's valuable, is pleasure. Two is an observation about, or a statement of, the nature of pleasure, what pleasure is. Pleasure is delight in attaining a valuable object. You derive pleasure when you get something that you find valuable. And the more valuable the thing it is, the more pleasure you get out of it. So if you have this crush, there's this person you like, and you invite them out, and they accept, and you go on the date, the more pleasure it is to see the person sitting across the table. The more pleasurable that experience is co-varies, depends upon how valuable you find it, how much, how big the crush is, how much you think that there's prospects for, there being a good relationship there, and so on. All sorts of factors that give rise to the greater pleasure of the experience depend upon you thinking that, you believing that, you valuing the thing that is happiness as something worthwhile. If you go out with someone because you have nothing else better to do that night, and why not? It'd be better than sitting at your home by yourself. Chances are, that you're pleasure of seeing the person across the table that night. It's not going to be that great, right? Because your expectations, your valuing of the activity, the date, it's pretty low. The pleasure that you get out of getting something, a career, a degree, a date, depends on you valuing the thing, you caring about the thing as something worth having. If you don't value, if you don't care about it, you won't get pleasure that much. And the more you value it, the more pleasurable the activity. So that's just premise three. The more valuable the object, the more you value it, the more pleasurable it is to attain it. And from that, something very interesting followed. If one only values pleasure, premise number one, then one never truly attains it. If when you ask someone out, your goal is not a relationship with a person, but rather what you feel like, your pleasurable experience of being with them, the pleasure is going to evaporate quickly, because the object of your value is not the thing that you're getting the date. It is your experience. But your experience presupposes it's only intelligible, the pleasurableness of your experience, if you care about the thing you're having, the thing you're attaining. So if you're only concerned, if you just look at yourself, your pleasure is going to dissipate very quickly. It's going to disappear very quickly. Why? Because it requires, it is the joy of attaining something that is valuable. And if you value nothing but your pleasure, you're not going to really get a lot of pleasure. Why? Because there's not going to be anything valuable for you to attain, to enjoy. So here's an example to get that off the ground. So the pleasures of love, what the pleasure of being in love, having a loving relationship, requires that you love someone, that you love the beloved, the object of your love, and not just your feelings towards the beloved. If you love your pleasure, if you love how you feel when you're with a person and not the person, that pleasure is going to disappear very quickly. And the pleasure is only going to stay there, the pleasure of love, if you truly love. Love is the thing that is grounding your pleasure. So it's fine to love your feelings of your pleasures of love, but they're going to disappear if that's the only thing you love. You must love the person with whom you have a relationship for the pleasure of love to be there. Otherwise, there's no love and therefore no pleasure of love. So a different way of saying the same thing is, if one loves one's feelings for the beloved instead of the beloved, one is not really in love, and therefore one's pleasures are not really the pleasures of love. They disappear. Okay, well, let's end there. I'll see you next time.